Welcome back to the Content Area Instructional Strategies Workshop from Southern Utah University. In this video, we want to focus on speaking strategies. So the goals of this video is to talk about why language output is important, and then to identify opportunities where your students can talk about the content that you're teaching them. Our key words here are output. Output is the opposite of input. We said input was listening and reading, or the decoding skills where they get the language and they have to decode it to get meaning. Output's the opposite. They have the meaning inside them and they've got to encode it in order to share that language with others. The affective filter. Affective filter is a barrier that we can have when we're doing something new, particularly learning language or new content. And what we want to do as language educators and teachers is to help lower the affective filter. In other words, help people feel at ease and calm and comfortable in the learning environment so that they will feel more open to experimenting and trying to use the language. And then our last word here is intelligible. Intelligible means easily to be understood. And we need to make a distinction sometimes that students think that the goal of learning a language is to sound like a native speaker. And that's not the goal, certainly not with English, because what is a native speaker of English? There are so many different types of English, just as there are so many different types of Spanish, that to be a native speaker means many different things. So instead of being a native speaker, their goal should be that they are intelligible, that their speech can be understood by other people. And that's really what the goal is, intelligibility, not native likeness. So here's our framework. We've talked about how to highlight the language of your content area. We've talked about encouraging reading and listening practices in your classroom. And now we're going to start talking about how to encourage output, the speaking and the writing. So let's talk about the output hypothesis. The output hypothesis is one of these many learning theories that helps inform our understanding of how language is acquired. And the output hypothesis says that learning takes place when students notice a gap in their language skills. They notice something that they want to do or that they need to do with the language, and they notice they don't have the language to do it. And so that helps them to focus, make a plan, learn the language they need, and then practice so they can overcome that gap. But they won't notice a gap if we don't require them to use the language. And so they need to do the output. They need to use language and be put in some situations that are just a little bit beyond their comfort zone. And that's when they start to notice, hey, I can do this, but I can't quite do this. I need the words or the forms or the knowledge to be able to make up that gap. So speaking is a really important thing that we need to do with language in order to be aware that we have these gaps. Now, the interaction hypothesis is related to this. The interaction hypothesis says we need to be producing language in order to learn and acquire language. But it's through that production and negotiation of meaning that we build our skills. So we try, and maybe we're not immediately successful. We try something different, and we keep that back and forth until we get to an understanding where we've been successful at communicating our meaning or resolving the task or doing whatever it is we want to do with the language. So that interaction is an important part of building those output skills. We need to practice output and we need to receive input back and feedback so that we know when we're being successful. So speaking is a great way to help practice output and to build those language negotiation skills so we can get to some kind of shared meaning with our audience. And so we need to make sure that in our classrooms, we're providing opportunities for students to speak, that there's an understanding that it's not just a receptive classroom, they're not just decoding, they're also going to be responsible for encoding. So we have talked about different strategies before when we talked about reading and listening. The bottom-up strategies and also the top-down strategies. We can think of it this way also with speaking. If there's a speaking task, we could do some more top-down strategies where we talk about, well, what should we do in this situation? What are the cultural expectations? What kinds of things would we talk about in this situation? How would we organize our information? What would we say first and next and after? Those are all possible top-down strategies. Bottom-up speaking strategies can involve things like pronunciation, explaining how certain sounds or letters, vowels are produced. We could also talk about specific vocabulary that we might need in order to accomplish a speaking task. So just like reading and listening, speaking also benefits from a combination of teaching top-down and bottom-up strategies. Now, there's also two different ways we can think about speaking activities. We could think of them as being prepared activities or spontaneous activities. A prepared activity is an activity where the learner is given time to think about what they're going to say before they say it, and they can practice before they present. So presentations are the most common type of prepared response, where learners can prepare visuals, they can practice, maybe there's a script or an outline that they work with. They have lots of time to do that. Prepared speaking isn't always unidirectional, so it's not always just the speaker speaking to the audience and that's the end. But most often it is. There are some more interactional types of prepared speaking. For example, you could do some preparation before a debate. And so you'd have some idea of what you want to say, but you don't always know what your partners are going to say. There's also some prepared kind of speaking, maybe a dialogue or a script, right? If students are going to present something they could practice together, and then they could present it. Spontaneous speaking is when there's no opportunity to prepare ahead of time. And this can happen with questions in a class, or students, a small group, are given a task and they just have to talk about it with each other right then. There's not an opportunity to prepare ahead of time. The task is given immediately and a response is required immediately. And it's good to have a mixture of both types of speaking in your classroom. Look for ways that students could do something that allows them a little bit of preparation before they speak, but also look for opportunities where students don't get to prepare. Because often many of our interactions, as we're functionally using a language, are spontaneous. So we do want to make sure that we're giving students the opportunity to learn how to speak spontaneously. We also want to make sure that, especially when we have spontaneous speaking production as part of our classroom, that students know some ground rules or some foundational principles of our classroom. And one of them is that it's okay to make mistakes. We want to lower that affective filter. So let them know mistakes are not only an acceptable, but sometimes a very important and central part of learning, that we need to make mistakes because mistakes help us understand what is and isn't possible with the language. There needs to be no ridicule or shaming when mistakes are made, and that we can feel comfortable asking questions. And so we need to establish a classroom that is more interactive and not just teacher focused, that the teacher is still the authority and maybe the expert in the classroom, but the teacher wants participation from the learners. And so if you can help your class understand that those are the expectations of the classroom, we're more likely to get students who will feel comfortable producing output in the classroom if they know that they won't always be judged unfairly for it or be graded for every time that they speak. So let's talk about some ways that you could give opportunities for students to speak. And one of them is simply when you ask a question in class to provide wait time. And I'm sure you're all aware of this, but this is what we call it in English. Wait time is when you ask a question and you give sometimes more than a minute of silence before students answer. And many teachers are not aware that they only sometimes wait a couple seconds before either they choose a student to answer, or if no student responds, they immediately answer for the class. And the fact is, when we're dealing with a language that we're learning, we need time to decode the question, to formulate a response, and then to encode our response into the language. And so wait time of a minute or two is really important to give learners that chance to formulate a response before they're expected to provide it. Now, with wait time, we could also think about this concept of the think, pair, share. So the think, pair, share can be used with questions. Teacher asks a question, but lets the class know, I'm not looking for anyone to answer yet. I want you to think about the answer. In fact, I'm going to give you a minute just to think, where no one will speak. Then after a minute or two, or whatever time you want, students know that then they will turn to a classmate and they will share what ideas they have about the question. And they share with each other. And maybe that takes another 1 or 2 minutes. And then that pair can turn to another pair. Now it's maybe a group of 4, and they share what their classmate told them. So if I'm working with Juan and I shared my idea with Juan and Juan shares his idea with me, now we're working with Julia and Christina, and I tell Julia and Christina what Juan told me, and he tells them what I told him. And so we're getting more opportunities to speak. Everyone's getting a chance to participate and answer the question. So the think, pair, and share. Now, does this take more time? Absolutely. I think pair share takes much more time than just asking a question and getting an answer. But the advantage is more people have now participated. More people have thought deeply about the question. More people have had a chance to use language to speak about it. So if we are going to use think, pair, share in our classrooms, and we're someone who loves to ask questions, we just need to be smarter and more careful about which questions we really want to include in the class. Instead of asking 10 questions, maybe we can only ask 3 or 4 questions during our class, but they're going to be the most useful, the most important questions. And the other questions, maybe they weren't as important anyways. And so this is a great way to get students to be using language in ways that are not as intimidating for some students. Sometimes it's hard to speak in front of the whole class, especially if you might make mistakes. But it's not as intimidating to speak maybe to just one classmate. And then that builds your confidence, and I can speak to another pair. And then maybe at the end, I'm even feeling comfortable enough that when the teacher asks groups to summarize, I might raise my hand and say, well, here's what my group talked about. Another way to encourage more speaking in the classroom is to rotate group roles. So if you use group work in your classroom, sometimes it tends to be the same students all the time who want to speak in the group. These are the students who are outgoing and confident. But you could tell students, hey, everyone's going to get a different role every week. We rotate. Some students are going to be paying attention to the time to make sure that we keep on time. Some students are going to focus on vocabulary. Maybe there was a reading that we have to do, and one student's going to say, hey, here I think are the most important vocabulary words that we learned in the reading. And someone else is going to be the group leader. And if you rotate every time, then it's not always the same student who's producing the output and the other students are just being quiet and listening. But you'll get more students taking on the role of the speaker and the group leader. One last strategy I want to share is one that I use a lot, especially when I'm dealing with speakers from a variety of different countries. Often when I don't understand what someone says, I am tempted to say, can you repeat that? Or say that again. And the problem is, even if they repeat it, I still can't understand it. And then I feel embarrassed and they feel embarrassed because I have to ask again, how can you say that again? So instead of saying, can you repeat that? I've tried this new strategy where when I don't understand something, I say, tell me more. And when I say tell me more, I am inviting the person to give me more details. They can elaborate. It invites them to give more information about the topic. It also encourages something that we can call circumlocution. Circumlocution is when we use different words to explain the same idea. And so the problem maybe with the first time they responded is that they used a pronunciation or they used an unusual word that I couldn't recognize. And if I ask them to just repeat, they're going to say the same thing again that I still can't understand. But if I say, tell me more, they're probably going to use different words and give me more information about their idea. And that could help me better understand the concept that they're saying. So tell me more is a great strategy, not only because it invites them to speak more, and we want people to speak, to practice, but it also helps make everyone feel more comfortable and doesn't make people feel ashamed or embarrassed because their pronunciation or their choice of vocabulary isn't comprehensible. So I hope that this has helped you spark some ideas about how you could further integrate speaking activities into your classroom, both spontaneous speaking and prepared speaking, and also giving you some ideas about how to encourage bottom-up and top-down speaking strategies for your students.